The SS couldn't understand how 7,220 Jews, including children, escaped by boat in a single night. Abraham, the Danish resistance Copenhagen, occupied Denmark, October 1st, 1943, 8:15 p.m. Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Mildner, head of the Gestapo in Denmark, stared out toward Copenhagen's harbor with a frustration that was tipping into disbelief. His men had sealed off the Jewish district at 6 p.m., exactly as planned. The large-scale roundup, an operation meant to arrest every Danish Jew in a single night and deport them to concentration camps, should have run like clockwork. Berlin's orders had been explicit. On the night of October 1st to 2nd, arrest roughly 8,000 Danish Jews. Transport was already arranged. Theresienstadt was ready. It was the kind of standard operation the Nazis had carried out successfully in dozens of European cities. But something had gone catastrophically, impossibly wrong. Gestapo agents had kicked in doors at around 1,400 known Jewish addresses, Copenhagen and the surrounding towns. They stormed synagogues, businesses, apartments. They searched basements, attics, warehouses. They found almost no one. Out of roughly 8,000 Danish Jews, the Nazis captured exactly 284 that night. Mostly elderly people in care homes who couldn't be moved, some patients in hospitals, and a handful who simply hadn't received the warning in time. The other 7,220 had vanished. Completely. As if they'd evaporated. "Where are they?" Mildner roared at his deputy, slamming his fist on the desk so hard that papers jumped. 8,000 people don't disappear overnight. They have to be somewhere. What Mildner didn't know, what Nazi intelligence had failed to detect despite 3 years of occupation, was that, at that very moment, while he was shouting in his office, roughly 7,220 Danish Jews were being moved in an improvised flotilla of hundreds of fishing boats, sailboats, ferries, rowboats, canoes, anything that could float across the 15 kilometers of the Öresund Strait to neutral Sweden. It was the largest and most successful rescue operation of the entire Holocaust. And it wasn't organized by a government or an army, but by ordinary Danish citizens who simply decided their Jewish neighbors were not going to be deported. Not in their country. Not while there were boats in the harbor and Sweden was only 15 kilometers away. In fishing villages along the Danish coast, Gilleleje, Snekkersten, Humlebæk, Elsinore. The same scenes played out again and again. Jewish families hidden in churches, hospitals, private homes. Fishermen pushing their boats into the Black Sea. Doctors sedating babies so they wouldn't cry during the crossing. Danish police not noticing, on purpose, the mass movement toward the shore. In Gilleleje alone, 19 boats left that night, each overloaded with 30 to 50 refugees. In Snekkersten, ferries built to carry 100 passengers ran with 200 crammed on board for each trip. In Elsinore, even small rowboats, 2 fishermen at the oars, carried families of 5 across the strait. And in Copenhagen, at Bispebjerg Hospital, about 2,000 Jews were hidden in basements, chapels, morgues, empty operating rooms, waiting to be transported to the coast under the protection of doctors and nurses who had turned the hospital into a massive transit station. All of it was coordinated in roughly 48 hours. No government planning, no military resources. Just ordinary people responding to a simple moral question. Will we allow our neighbors to be murdered? The answer was no. This is the story of how an entire nation became a resistance network. How Danish fishermen turned their boats into arks of spas, lifeboats of salvation. How 7,220 Jews crossed into Sweden in a rescue operation that unfolded over about 3 weeks, but reached its most intense moment on the night of October 1st to 2nd. when thousands crossed simultaneously while the Gestapo searched desperately and found only empty rooms. And it's the story of how the Nazis, so used to collaboration or indifference in the countries they occupied, never understood what it meant to occupy a place where ordinary decency was stronger than fear of the Reich. The SS couldn't understand how it happened, but it happened, and it changed the course of the Holocaust in an entire country. Occupied Denmark. The anomaly: Germany invaded Denmark on April 9, 1940, at 4:15 a.m. By 6 a.m., Danish military resistance had collapsed. King Christian X ordered a ceasefire to avoid massive civilian casualties. Denmark was occupied in less than 6 hours, the fastest conquest of the war. But Denmark's occupation was unusual from the very beginning. The Nazis viewed it as a model protectorate, a Germanic, Aryan country that could be folded into the Reich peacefully. For strategic and propaganda reasons, they treated Denmark differently than they treated Poland, France, or other occupied territories. The differences were striking. The Danish government remained functional. Unlike in other occupied countries, Denmark's government kept operating and making decisions on internal affairs. The Nazis controlled foreign policy and security, but day-to-day administration remained Danish. King Christian X stayed in his palace. The king became a symbol of passive resistance. Famously, he rode his horse through Copenhagen every morning without bodyguards, a deliberate display that Denmark had not been conquered in spirit. Anti-Jewish policy wasn't implemented immediately. Wanting to preserve the appearance of a model protectorate, the Nazis didn't impose anti-Jewish laws right away. Danish Jews continued working, attending school, and living normally. This created a unique situation. A relatively small Jewish population, around 8,000 people, about 7,500 native Danish Jews, plus roughly 500 Jewish refugees from Germany, living in a society that had not segregated them, where they were neighbors, colleagues, and friends to non-Jews. Unlike Poland or France, where the centuries of anti-Semitism had created deep social divisions, in Denmark, Jews were simply Danes who practiced a different religion, and that integration would become the key that made the rescue possible. The warning. On September 28, 1943, everything changed. Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German naval attaché in Copenhagen, was a Nazi on paper, more out of career convenience than ideological conviction. But he had contacts in the Danish resistance and a growing revulsion toward Nazi policy. On September 28th, Duckwitz attended a meeting in Berlin where he was told the plan: a mass roundup of all Danish Jews, scheduled for the night of October 1st to 2nd. Full operation, no exceptions. Duckwitz returned to Copenhagen, facing a moral cliff. He could stay silent and allow the deportation of 8,000 people. Or he could warn someone, an act of betrayal that would mean immediate execution if discovered. That afternoon, Duckwitz quietly visited Hans Hedtoft, a leader of Denmark's Social Democratic Party. In a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes, Duckwitz laid it all out. The date of the raid, its scope, the deportation plan. "You have 3 days," Duckwitz said. 3 days to evacuate 8,000 people, or they'll be sent to death camps. Hedtoft acted immediately. He contacted leaders of the Jewish community. He contacted church leadership. He contacted resistance networks. He sent the message through channels that had been built underground over 3 years of occupation. On September 29th, during Rosh Hashanah services in synagogues across Denmark, rabbis told their congregations, "The Nazis plan to arrest all of us in 2 nights. You must hide, you must escape, you must leave now." Some Jewish families didn't believe it. It sounded impossible. Denmark had been relatively safe for 3 years. Why would it change now? But others remembered what had happened in Germany, Poland, France. They didn't wait for more confirmation. They began packing immediately. And then something extraordinary happened. Their non-Jewish Danish neighbors started showing up at their doors. The spontaneous mobilization, what followed over the next 48 hours, had no precedent in occupied Europe. Across Denmark, ordinary citizens, without government orders, without formal organization, simply chose to help. They knocked on Jewish neighbors' doors and said the same thing again and again. "We've been told the Nazis are coming for you. Come with us. We can hide you." The same scenes repeated in hundreds of places. In Copenhagen, a Jewish family was shaken awake at 2 a.m. by a non-Jewish neighbor. "Pack one suitcase. You're coming to my place. Now." In Odense, a hospital director turned his entire hospital into a shelter. Real patients were discharged early. 200 Jews were admitted as patients with contagious illnesses, requiring quarantine, a coded system for hiding people in plain sight. In Aalborg, elementary school teachers hid 40 Jewish families inside a school building by day, then moved them to farms in the countryside by night. In Aarhus, a pastor turned his church into a transit station. Hundreds passed through in 3 days, hidden in the crypt, the sacristy, even under pews during services. There was no single master plan. Each community improvised based on geography, local resources, and the risks in front of them. But the goal was shared everywhere. Get Jews out of the cities, move them to the coast, and get them across to Sweden. Bispebjerg Hospital, the central transit hub. In Copenhagen, Bispebjerg Hospital became the unofficial command center of the rescue. Its chief physician, Dr. Karl Henrik Kuster, not related to the doctor in Odense, convened an emergency meeting of staff on September 29th. "Colleagues," he said, "the Nazis plan to deport every Danish Jew. This will not happen from our hospital. We are turning Bispebjerg into a refuge. Who's with me?" Every doctor, every nurse, every orderly raised a hand. Over the next 72 hours, Bispebjerg ran the rescue at an industrial scale. The admission operation. Jews arrived claiming vague symptoms: stomach pain, dizziness, heart palpitations. They were admitted immediately. False medical files were created. They were placed in wards declared under quarantine for typhus, keeping German inspectors away. Within 3 days, roughly 2,000 Jews were admitted to Bispebjerg. The hospital had only 800 beds. Staff improvised. People slept on floors, in corridors, in the hospital chapel, even in the morgue, with the grim understanding that the last place Nazis would think to look for living people was on autopsy tables. The transport operation. Each night, the hospital's ambulances, normally 4 vehicles for medical emergencies, multiplied. Staff requisitioned private cars, marked them with improvised red crosses, and declared them emergency transport. The ambulances drove refugees to coastal towns, typically 30 to 40 kilometers away, a 45 to 60-minute trip. Each ambulance made 3 or 4 runs per night. German inspectors occasionally stopped them. Drivers would explain, "We're transporting contagious patients to an isolation hospital in Elsinore," and produce perfectly forged medical documents made by hospital administrators. The Nazis, terrified of infectious disease, waved the ambulances through without detailed inspection. The funding operation. Transport cost money. Fishermen demanded payment, not out of greed, but because many were poor men risking their boats and their lives. The typical price was 500 to 1,000 kroner per person, roughly $2,000 to $4,000 in today's money. Many Jewish families could pay, but poorer refugees could not. Bispebjerg's staff organized an emergency fund. Doctors and nurses contributed wages. The hospital quietly diverted budget funds. Danish churches donated from charity collections. Anonymous business owners sent cash. No one who needed help was turned away. People were sent to safety regardless of their ability to pay. The fishing villages Denmark's geography made the rescue possible. A peninsula connected to Germany, plus an archipelago of 400+ islands. At the narrowest point of the Øresund Strait, the Danish coast is only 15 kilometers from Sweden. Sweden was neutral, and on October 2nd, it publicly declared it would grant asylum to all Danish Jewish refugees. Crossing to Sweden meant guaranteed safety, but crossing required boats, and boats meant fishermen. Fishing towns along the northern coast of Zealand, Denmark's main island, became embarkation points. Gilleleje, population 1,200. About 1,000 Jews passed through Gilleleje. 19 fishing boats took part. Each boat made 5 to 8 trips. One crossing took 45 minutes to an hour. The cost was typically 500 to 800 kroner per person. Snekkersten, population 800. About 1,200 Jews boarded here. It included ferries that normally ran the Elsinore to Helsingborg route. The ferries kept operating normally, except they carried 200 passengers instead of 100. The extra were refugees. Nazi inspectors sometimes checked ferries, but rarely counted passengers carefully. Humlebæk, population 600. About 800 Jews boarded here, using private sailboats, fishing boats, even kayaks and canoes for short hops to islands that then connected them onward to Sweden. Elsinore, population 15,000. The largest town involved, with about 2,500 Jews embarked. The operation was more organized. Local resistance coordinated departure times, routes, and payments. The pattern was similar everywhere. Refugees arrived by ambulance, private car, truck, or on foot. They were hidden in churches, fishing warehouses, and private homes until nightfall. After dark, around 8 p.m. in October, they were moved to the Asialstur docks, loaded onto boats, typically 20 to 50 people per fishing boat, and ferried across the Øresund, 45 to 90 minutes depending on conditions and the vessel. They landed in Swedish ports, mainly Helsingborg, Landskrona, and Malmö, where Swedish authorities received them, processed them, and provided temporary shelter. The night of October 1st to 2nd, the night the Nazis had planned as a mass roundup, became the night of a mass evacuation. At 8 p.m. on October 1st, while the Gestapo was kicking down doors in Copenhagen and finding empty apartments, parallel scenes were unfolding in dozens of coastal towns. In Gilleleje, 8:15 p.m., Gilleleje's church was packed, not for a service, but as a staging point for roughly 100 refugees waiting to be moved. Pastor Kjeldgaard Jensen organized them into groups of 20 to 25, matching numbers to the capacity of the boats waiting at the dock. Goldstein family, 20 people, boat 4 leaving in 15 minutes. Abrahamson family, 6 people, boat 7 leaving in 30 minutes. It felt like an improvised airport, with a pastor acting as air traffic control. The refugees were terrified, but disciplined. Parents held small children close. Younger people supported the elderly. Everyone carried a single small suitcase, everything they could take from their former lives. In Snekkersten, 8:30 p.m. A bookkeeper named Erling Kier ran the operation from his apartment overlooking the strait. With binoculars, he tracked German patrols. When a patrol drifted south, he flashed a signal with a small flashlight toward the fishermen waiting offshore. Boats left immediately. A simple system, but brutally effective. On the night of October 1st to 2nd, 17 boats slipped out of Snekkersten without being detected. In Humlebeck, 8:45 p.m., there was a problem. A family with a 6-month-old baby. Babies cry. A single whale could bring a patrol running. Dr. Jürgen Gersfeldt, a local physician who had come to help with the evacuation, had a solution. "We'll sedate the baby," he said. "A tiny dose. The child will sleep through the crossing." The parents were terrified, but they understood the stakes. Dr. Gersfeldt administered a carefully calculated sedative. Enough for deep sleep, not enough to endanger the child. The baby slept peacefully through the 50-minute trip to Sweden. The child woke up in a new country, alive and safe. That scene repeated itself dozens of times. Doctors along the coast sedated babies and small children, a medically risky practice, but one that felt necessary. Nearly all of those infants reached Sweden safely. At Bispebjerg Hospital, 9 p.m., Dr. Kuster coordinated the final evacuation of about 200 refugees who had been hidden inside the hospital. 10 ambulances were waiting. "Groups of 20, he instructed. Ambulances 1 through 5 go to Gilleleja. Ambulances 6 through 10 go to Snekkersten. Staggered departures every 10 minutes so we don't attract attention." The ambulances rolled out in sequence. Each passed multiple German checkpoints. Each was stopped, briefly inspected, and allowed to continue. By midnight, every ambulance had delivered its cargo to the coastal towns. Every one of them turned around and headed back to Copenhagen for the next wave. On the strait, 10:30 p.m. Roughly 100 boats were on the water at the same time. From above, if anyone had been watching, it would have looked like a massive flotilla. But the Nazis had no night air patrols over the Øresund. The German Navy had only a handful of patrol boats available, most deployed to the North Sea or the Baltic. The Øresund was considered low threat. That security blind spot allowed dozens of boats to cross undetected. Some boats did encounter German patrols, and when they did, the outcome could swing in any direction. Encounter 1. A German patrol stopped the fishing boat captained by Hans Jensen. "Where are you going at this hour?" a German officer demanded. "Night fishing," Jensen replied. "Herring, the best catch is at night." The officer swept the deck with a flashlight and saw fishing nets, deliberately laid out for cover. He did not see the hold below deck, where 35 refugees were packed in absolute silence, some barely breathing. "Carry on," the officer ordered. Jensen carried on, just not toward any fishing ground. He headed straight for Sweden. Encounter 2. A German patrol clearly spotted refugees aboard Captain Erik Andersen's boat. The officer ordered Andersen to turn back to a Danish port. Andersen gunned the engine and ignored the command. The patrol opened fire. Bullets slapped the water beside the boat. Andersen didn't slow. His boat was faster than the patrol craft. He reached Swedish territorial waters. Swedish Coast Guards intervened and prevented the German patrol from pursuing. All 28 refugees aboard Andersen's boat arrived safely. The hull was punched with bullet holes. Andersen patched them and made 6 more trips that same week. Encounter 3. Captain Christian Thomson's boat was stopped. Refugees were discovered. Everyone was arrested, the refugees and Thomson himself. Thomson was sent to a concentration camp in Germany. He survived the war. He never expressed regret. "I'd do it again," he said. It was the right thing. The refugees on his boat, 23 people, were deported to Theresienstadt. 19 survived the war. The 3 weeks. Although the night of October 1st to 2nd was the most intense moment of the rescue, the evacuation continued for 3 weeks. The Nazis, shaken by the initial disappearance of thousands of Jews, intensified the search. The Danes intensified the rescue in response. Week 1, October 1st to 7th. Roughly 5,000 Jews evacuated. 284 were captured in the initial raid. The operation centered on larger fishing towns, Gilleleje, Snekkersten, Elsinore. Week 2, October 8th to 14th. Roughly 1,500 more evacuated. The operation expanded to smaller ports and more creative routes. Nazi patrols increased, more boats were intercepted, but most still got through. Week 3, October 15th to 21st. Roughly 700 more evacuated, mainly Jews who had initially hidden in the countryside and were now being moved. There were also dramatic rescues of people who had been captured and then managed to escape. Total evacuated to Sweden, about 7,220 out of roughly 8,000 Danish Jews. Success rate, 90.25%. Danish Jews who died in the Holocaust, 102, mostly those captured and deported to Theresienstadt. Even there, the Danish government and the Danish Red Cross monitored their treatment, sent food parcels, and pressured for improved conditions. Protection that Jews from other countries simply didn't receive. Why Denmark was different? Historians have argued for decades. Why was the rescue of Denmark's Jews so successful when, in almost every other occupied country, the majority of Jews were murdered? The answer is a combination of factors. Favorable geography. Neutral Sweden was only 15 kilometers away. Crossing the Öresund was difficult, but possible, unlike Poland, where neutral borders were hundreds of kilometers away. A small Jewish population. 8,000 people was a manageable number compared with France, around 330,000 Jews, or Poland, around 3 million. Scale matters. Early warning. Thanks to Duckwitz, Danes had roughly 72 hours of notice. In many other countries, roundups were total surprise. Integration. Danish Jews weren't isolated in ghettos. They were co-workers, classmates, neighbors, friends. That personal connection fueled action. A strong democratic tradition. Denmark had a functioning democracy until the occupation. People were used to initiative rather than waiting for central authority. When the state couldn't act, citizens did. King Christian as a symbol. The king openly opposed anti-Jewish policies. The story that he wore a yellow star is a myth. It starts was never required in Denmark. But his known stance gave moral permission for resistance. The Danish Lutheran Church. Danish bishops publicly condemned deportations from the pulpit. A pastoral letter read in every church on October 3rd denounced Nazi actions and called on Christians to help Jews, providing broad moral cover. The Danish police did not cooperate. Unlike police in France, the Netherlands, and other countries, Danish police refused to take part in raids. Many actively helped the rescue. That refusal was critical. A soft occupation. Ironically, the Nazi effort to keep Denmark a model protectorate meant fewer troops, less Gestapo presence, and less surveillance. Space the resistance could exploit. Sweden was willing to help. Sweden didn't just remain neutral. It openly invited Danish Jewish refugees and provided resources. Without Sweden's cooperation, the crossing would have been pointless. But more than anything else, it was a collective decision by the Danish people that deportation was unacceptable. This was not the heroism of a few, it was the ordinary decency of thousands. The individual stories behind the statistics were thousands of individual lives. The Goldstein family, Isaac Goldstein, a 45-year-old tailor, his wife Rachel, and their 4 children, ages 4 to 14, lived in a small apartment in Copenhagen. On September 29th, their neighbor Mr. Nielsen, a man who had lived in the same building for 12 years but barely spoke to them, knocked on their door at midnight. "They're coming for you," Nielsen said. "Pack, you're coming to my apartment, now." The Goldsteins lived in Nielsen's apartment for 3 days. Nielsen and his wife slept in the living room and gave the Goldsteins their bedroom. On October 2nd, Nielsen drove them to Gilleleje. He paid 3,000 kroner, his life savings, to a fisherman to take them across. "How will we ever repay you?" Isaac asked. "You don't owe me anything," Nielsen replied. "You're Danes, I'm Danish. Danes help each other." The Goldsteins reached Sweden. They survived the war. They returned to Denmark in 1945. Nielsen was waiting for them at the dock, smiling. "Welcome home." Isaac spent years trying to repay the debt. Nielsen eventually accepted only 500 kroner, insisting, "The rest is a gift. Do something good with it. Help someone else." Dr. Arne Christensen. A young doctor at Bispebjerg, Dr. Christensen personally drove an ambulance 47 times during the 3 weeks of rescue. He transported roughly 400 refugees. On his 38th run, he was stopped at a German checkpoint. The inspector suspected the patients were refugees and demanded to inspect the back. Christensen improvised instantly. "These patients have smallpox," he said, "highly contagious. If you insist on inspecting them, I'll have to report that you've been exposed. That means a mandatory 21-day quarantine." The inspector, terrified of infection, waved the ambulance through. There was no smallpox, only a terrified family of 6 in the back, whose lives were saved by a convincing medical lie. Erling Kier, the man from Snekkersten. Kier, a 30-year-old bookkeeper, coordinated the transport of about 1,200 refugees from Snekkersten. He operated from his apartment, watching German patrols through binoculars and signaling fishermen with a flashlight. He kept meticulous coded records of every person moved, names, dates, boats used. After the war, those records helped separated families reunite. Kier was never caught. He ran the operation for 3 weeks without a single failure. When asked how he avoided detection, he said, "Luck, pure luck, and the fact that the Nazis assumed no one would be bold enough to coordinate a rescue operation from an apartment overlooking the coast." Captain Carl Anderson. A 58-year-old fisherman from Gilleleje, Anderson made 23 trips to Sweden in 3 weeks, transporting about 600 people. On his 9th trip, his engine died in the middle of the Öresund. He drifted with 45 refugees on board as a German patrol approached. Anderson fixed the engine in 18 minutes while refugees prayed in every language and religion represented on the boat. The engine started again just as the patrol came within 200 meters. He reached Sweden. The refugees collected money and gave him an extra 2,000 kroner as an engine repair bonus. Anderson used it to buy a more reliable engine and continued the rescue with improved efficiency. The Nazis, completely baffled Nazi frustration, is documented in reports that survived the war. Mildner's report to Berlin, October 3, 1943. The operation was a failure. Of approximately 8,000 Jews, we captured only 284. The remainder have disappeared. Interrogations suggest mass evacuation to Sweden, but the scale is impossible to confirm. How did 7,000 plus people cross without detection? The Danish population clearly collaborated. I recommend reprisals against collaborators. Berlin's response: do not implement mass reprisals. Denmark must remain a model protectorate for propaganda purposes. Continue searching for remaining Jews. Intensify coastal patrols. Mildner's report, October 15th. Intensified patrols have captured only 37 additional Jews. The evacuation continues despite increased efforts. Danish fishermen operate with impunity. Danish police do not cooperate with investigations. The entire population appears involved in the conspiracy. An unprecedented situation. Gestapo analysis, November 1943. The Danish case represents a complete failure of deportation policy. Contributing factors: favorable geography, proximity to neutral Sweden, early warning, source suspected but unconfirmed, non-cooperation of Danish authorities, civilian participation on an unusual scale. Lesson learned. In countries where Jews are integrated and the population is unified in opposition, mass deportation is tactically difficult without substantially increased military resources. Recommendation: Denmark is an anomaly. Do not adjust policy based on this unique case. The Nazis never fully understood what had happened. They were used to indifference or collaboration. The idea of an entire nation risking itself to save Jewish neighbors didn't fit their mental model of occupied Europe. Sweden responds. Sweden's role was crucial. A neutral country could have closed its border and turned refugees away. Instead, it opened the door. On October 2, 1943, the Swedish government announced publicly, Sweden will grant asylum to all Danish Jewish refugees, without numerical limits, without restrictions. In Swedish ports, Helsingborg, Landskrona, Malmö, the same scenes repeated daily for 3 weeks. Boats arrived overloaded, carrying exhausted refugees who could barely believe they were safe. Swedish authorities met them with blankets, hot food, and temporary shelter. There was no long asylum process, no interrogation about legal status. One simple question: are you coming from Denmark, fleeing the Nazis? Yes. Welcome to Sweden. You're safe now. Sweden set up temporary refugee camps, functional but dignified. Refugees received shelter, often in schools, gyms, and converted public buildings. Food, not lavish, but sufficient. Free medical care, work permits, and schooling for children in Swedish schools. About 7,220 Danish Jewish refugees lived in Sweden from October 1943 until May 1945, when Denmark was liberated. Most returned after the war and found their apartments, businesses, and possessions largely intact, because Danish neighbors had protected their property during their absence. It was a stunning contrast to Jews in many other countries, who returned to find everything stolen, destroyed, or occupied. The final tally totaled Jews in Denmark, September 1943. About 8,000 successfully evacuated to Sweden. 7,220, 90.25%, captured by the Nazis. 580 total, 284 in the initial raid, October 1st to 2nd. 296 captured later during the 3-week evacuation, deported to Theresienstadt. 464 died in Theresienstadt. 51 survived the war. 413 overall survival rate of Danish Jews. 99%, 7,633 of the 7,684 who were alive. In October 1943 survived the war. Compare that to survival rates elsewhere. Poland, approximately 10% survived the Netherlands. Approximately 25% survived France. Approximately 75% survived Denmark. Approximately 99% survived non-Jewish Danes executed for helping Jews. About 100 fishermen involved, about 400 to 500 boats used, about 600 to 800 counting repeated trips. Total cost, about 12 million kroner, roughly approximately $80 million today. Mostly paid by the Jewish community with substantial donations from non-Jewish Danes, the Danish righteous. After the war, Yad Vashem faced a unique problem with Denmark. Normally, the honor, righteous among the nations, is awarded to specific individuals who saved Jews. But in Denmark, who do you honor? Thousands took part. How do you single out names when it was essentially a national effort? In 1971, Yad Vashem made an unprecedented decision. It declared the Danish people collectively righteous among the nations. It remains the only case in which an entire nation received the honor. There is a grove at Yad Vashem known as the Danish Forest, planted in tribute to the rescue. And several individuals were also recognized, including Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, the German diplomat who gave the warning King Christian X, whose symbolic opposition mattered enormously, Pastor Kjeldgaard Jensen, who coordinated rescues in Gilleleje, Dr. Karl Henrik Köster, who turned Bispebjerg Hospital into a refuge, Erlenkier, who coordinated evacuations from Snekkersten, but most fishermen, doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, and families who hid refugees were never recorded. They did what they believed was the obvious moral duty, and then went back to ordinary life. The lessons of Denmark. Holocaust historians study Denmark because it shows what was possible when a population decided to resist. Key lessons. Early warning matters. 3 days of notice made organization possible. In other countries, surprise raids killed any chance of response. Geography matters, but it isn't enough. Yes, Sweden was close, but the crossing was dangerous and required boats and coordination. Geography created an opening. Danes executed it. Social integration reduces the machinery of genocide. Where Jews were neighbors rather than a segregated other, non-Jews had more reason to act. Non-cooperation by local authorities is critical. When Danish police refused to help, deportation became exponentially harder. Symbolism matters. The king's opposition gave moral cover. Leadership, even symbolic, matters. Scale is not an excuse. People often say, Poland had 3 million Jews, so saving them was impossible. Denmark proved that when a population decides, even large numbers can be moved. A nearby neutral refuge changes everything. Sweden provided a real destination. Without it, refugees would have been forced into hiding inside Denmark, temporary and fragile. But the deepest lesson is this: genocide requires local collaboration or local indifference. When a population rejects both, genocide becomes logistically difficult. The Nazis were able to murder millions in Poland because collaborators identified Jews, and the wider population was largely indifferent or actively anti-Semitic. In Denmark, the Nazis found neither collaboration nor indifference. They found active opposition from an entire society. Epilogue: The Return. In May 1945, Denmark was liberated. Word traveled through Sweden. The war is over. It's safe to go home. Danish Jewish refugees began the journey back, many in the same boats that had carried them to Sweden 18 months earlier. When they arrived in Danish ports, they were met by crowds, not with grand parades, but with neighbors waiting to welcome them back. The same scenes repeated in dozens of places. The Goldstein family returned to Copenhagen. Mr. Nielsen was waiting at the dock. "Welcome home. Your apartment's ready. I watered your plants." The plants had survived. Inside the apartment, everything was exactly as they'd left it. Nielsen had paid their rent out of his own pocket for 18 months. That was the rule, not the exception. Across Denmark, returning Jewish families found apartments intact, cared for by neighbors, businesses maintained by non-Jewish partners who returned full ownership, valuables stored safely, pets cared for. It was so unusual that American journalists reporting from Denmark struggled to believe it. In almost every other European country, returning Jews found looted homes, occupied apartments, and destroyed businesses. Only in Denmark did going home truly mean going home. The last word. In 1963, on the 20th anniversary of the rescue, the Danish Jewish community erected a monument in Copenhagen with a simple inscription. In October 1943, the Danish people saved 7,220 Jews from Nazi deportation. They did it not through extraordinary heroism, but through ordinary decency. We remember not only those who were saved, but those who saved them. Fishermen, doctors, neighbors, who risked everything because it was the right thing to do. At the dedication ceremony, Arne Christensen, the doctor who had driven the ambulance 47 times, now 63 years old, spoke. We weren't heroes. We were Danes doing what Danes do, looking after other Danes. Danish Jews weren't Jews to us. They were Danes, our neighbors, our friends, our family. The Nazis never understood that. They thought they could split Denmark into Aryans and non-Aryans. But in Denmark, there was only one category: Danish. And Danes don't abandon Danes. It's that simple. The SS couldn't understand how 7,220 Jews escaped by boat. They couldn't grasp that an entire nation had become a rescue network. They couldn't understand that ordinary decency, multiplied by thousands, turns into a force even the Reich can't defeat. The Nazis had weapons, laws, military power. The Danes had fishing boats, ambulances, and quiet courage. The boats won, decency won, Denmark won, and 7,220 people lived to tell the story. Finn, the rescue of Danish Jews in October 1943, remains the most successful rescue effort of the Holocaust. Roughly 90% of Denmark's Jews were evacuated to safety in Sweden, far higher than survival rates in most other occupied countries. It was not a government or military-led operation. It was a spontaneous mobilization of ordinary people. Fishermen, doctors, nurses, neighbors, who decided the deportation of their Jewish compatriots was unacceptable. The SS never understood how it happened. They searched for a secret organization, a central leadership, a complex conspiracy. What they found was ordinary, people doing extraordinary things because they believed it was morally right. Denmark proved that genocide can be resisted, that populations are not powerless, that collective decency can defeat even a well-armed system. 7,220 lives saved. A nation that refused to collaborate. A lesson for every generation. When good people act, numbers don't matter. What matters is the will to act.